Chapter 13, Nationalism, Imperialism, and the Great War. Part 1, Nationalism and Imperialism. Part 1, European Imperialism. It's hard today to understand that in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, empire was not a dirty word, but was quite the opposite, able to bring patriotic tears to one's eyes as one reviewed the blessings brought to the world through the West's political, economic, cultural, or even religious undertakings abroad. As with all aggressive dominators, the ability to rationalize such aggression with high-sounding moral logic was truly amazing, even shocking. But keep in mind that it was the age of Darwin and social progress. Darwinism, with its survival of the fittest mentality, made the justification of imperial aggression very natural, even laudable. National interest at the heart of European imperialism. Actually, imperialism, as practiced in the 1800s and early 1900s, involved simply the transferring away from the European and American West of the natural aggressive tendencies of the West's new, rising, and highly ambitious national political actors. This redirection of competitive instincts abroad would help immensely to keep peace within the West itself, for a while, that is, until there were no more unclaimed overseas territories available to throw to the hungry empires. When that happened, by 1914, all hell broke loose. The Great War, or World War I. No two nations explain the blessings of imperialism exactly the same way, but that's because each of these dominators understood themselves in unique ways, and therefore moralized their imperialism in unique ways. In other words, there was no one standard thing called imperialism. It was simply nationalism written large, nation by nation. The Portuguese. The Portuguese got an early start on commercial imperialism in the 1400s, setting out from their Atlantic ports and slowly advancing south down the African coast until they reached the southern tip, establishing Portuguese trading posts along the way, most prominently at the Cape of South Africa. Once around South Africa, the Portuguese headed toward India, again establishing trading posts, the most notable and enduring being Goa on the Indian west coast, and then heading on around India towards the valuable Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. From there they would, by the mid-1500s, even head north to China, establishing another port along the southern Chinese coast at Macau. They would later lose some of these holdings to the Dutch, but hold on to others, such as Goa and Macau, and their positions in Africa at Angola and Mozambique, well into the 20th century. The Spanish. The Spanish found their way to the wealth of the Far East blocked by the Portuguese, so at the end of the 1400s, they headed west across the Atlantic, and in doing so, stumbled into the Americas, and a vast amount of gold they were able to acquire, plundering the Aztec and Incan empires. The wealth was so vast that they had to, and were able to, build a huge navy to protect the transfer of that wealth from America to Spain, where, interestingly, it soon ended up in the hands of the Dutch, protecting that wealth from pirates that lurked in the Caribbean waters where their American empire was headquartered. But their thirst for increasing the number of Catholic souls at a time that Protestantism was driving Catholicism from its religious monopoly in Europe became another key motif of Spanish imperialism. Huge numbers of Catholic priests were sent to establish missions among the new Indian subjects of the Spanish kings. thus bringing Spanish America emotionally as well as materially into the realm of Spanish feudalism. This social cultural legacy became so well established that even when these colonies broke free from their Spanish and closely related Portuguese sovereigns in the early 1800s, the cultural patterns established through this imperialism remained firmly in place. Indeed, by the late 1800s, a romantic revival of Spanish nationalism was taking place in Spain, looking to Spanish America to rebuild the Spanish Catholic cultural ties that once existed between Spain and America. But Yankee Americans had other ideas. They wanted to democratize this culture, and thus found themselves intervening frequently in the affairs of their neighbors to the south, under the principle of the Monroe Doctrine. These interventions, usually by the U.S. Marines, helped support U.S. economic interests in Latin America, but had little impact on the political culture of the region, producing instead a lot of anti-Yankee resentment. The Dutch. While the Portuguese and Spanish were busy setting their overseas empires in place, the Protestant Dutch were busy fending off the Spanish kings, that's the Habsburg family ruling the huge Spanish empire that actually originated in the Dutch Netherlands, trying to force the Dutch provinces back into submission to Catholic Spain. The effort drained Spanish power considerably. Footnote, the disastrous attempt at about the same time, 1588, to do the same thing to Protestant England by sending their mighty Spanish armada, that is, navy, against the English also drained Spanish power considerably. The effort of the Spanish instead strengthened Dutch power and resolve all the more. When Spanish power became feeble enough in the early 1600s, the Dutch then headed out on their own to explore the larger world, mostly following the Portuguese imperial route, seizing Portuguese ports along the way, notably South Africa and the Spice Islands, roughly modern Indonesia. The Dutch also established trading posts in North America in 1624 at the mouth of the Hudson River and the land behind it, on various islands in the Caribbean, and on the northeastern coast of South America at Suriname. Like the Portuguese, the Dutch Empire was largely commercial, that is, trading in valuable goods in nature, which included a vast number of Africans sold into slavery in order to work the highly valuable sugar plantations in the Caribbean and in the Americas, North and South. The British. Early British imperialism followed the pattern of the Portuguese and the Dutch, especially the Dutch, with whom the English found themselves in deep commercial competition, with several wars fought in the process. Like the Dutch, the English were early capitalists, forming joint stock corporations to amass the amount of investment money needed to pay for very expensive private business operations, meaning not funded by the monarchy. A number of companies, we already know of the Virginia and Plymouth companies, reached great size, such as the Muscovy Company in 1555, trying unsuccessfully to reach China by way of a northeast passage across the Arctic, or at least Russia, and the East India Company, though, as with all business enterprises, they had their ups and downs. The East India Company reached such sizable proportions that it became almost a government in itself, securing political as well as economic dominance over most of India and parts of China. After American independence, a rebellion itself sparked by attempting to establish a monopoly by the company of the tea trade with the American colonies, the British Empire and the East India Company were almost one and the same. The focus of the company's activities was India, a huge subcontinent over which the company secured political control through an array of separate agreements with various local Indian lords or rajas. In essence, the Indian rajas agreed to place themselves under the company's protection in order to facilitate the all-important trade of tea, cotton, indigo, and salt from India in exchange for the finished textiles of England. Backing up this arrangement was the company's own private army, made up of local Hindu and Muslim mercenaries, or sepoys, commanded locally by some of the rajas, but ultimately by company officers themselves. It was all quite a noble arrangement for many Indians and Englishmen. The company and its army was an aggressive player in the international theater, fighting wars here and there in Asia, such as the one waged against the Chinese emperor, who tried, unsuccessfully, to stop the company from selling its highly profitable opium to his Chinese subjects. In essence, the company was the world's first major drug cartel. But troubles with its own Indian sepoys developed over the thoughtlessness of some of its English officers, and a huge rebellion resulted, 1857 to 1859, involving the death of large numbers of English officials and their families serving in India. When the rebellion was finally put down, British Parliament liquidated the company and took over its affairs directly, creating officially the British Empire, with Victoria now serving as the Empress of India, as well as Queen of England, Scotland, and Ireland, along with many other titles. These were the glory days of British imperialism, and the British Empire stood at the very heart of the whole European imperial system as its proudest symbol. The French. Not to be outdone by the English, the French sought a similar imperial status during the mid-1800s under the new French Emperor Louis Napoleon, or Napoleon III. He was actually nephew of the famous Napoleon of the earlier 1800s. The French were having a hard time emotionally with the fact that French culture had once, during the 1700s and much of the 1800s, been a central part of the culture of Europe's ruling classes, and that its decline in the face of rising linguistic nationalism in Europe was a major blow to French pride. France's imperial mission, therefore, seemed to be to compensate for this loss by taking French culture abroad, trying now to plant French culture among the ruling elite in French Indochina, comprised of Cochin China, that is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and also at various points along the African coast. The scramble for European imperial territory in Africa and the Middle East. Then, when in the latter part of the 1800s the Europeans began to take an interest in laying claim to the material wealth and the souls of the people in the dark unknown of interior Africa, the French made a huge effort to plant widely the French imperial flag there. Also, Egypt, at least since Napoleon's invasion there in the early 1800s, which was an unsuccessful effort to block Britain's passage from the Mediterranean to India, Egypt had long held French interest, and the French worked out a deal with the local king to build a canal at Suez, which then stirred British interest in the project. The British eventually bought out the king's interest in the Suez Canal, making European imperialism in Egypt at the very heart of the world of Islam a matter of cooperation between both the French and the English. Africa. Also interested in Africa were the recent arrivals on the European national scene, the Germans and the Italians. The many Italian city-states and regional kingdoms had united into a single Italian state in 1860, and much the same was the case for Germany in 1870. Now fully national as Italy and Germany, both new countries wanted a piece of the imperial action in Africa because that was about the only part of the earth that had not already been laid claim to by European imperialists. The Portuguese, of course, were already in Africa, coastal Angola, Mozambique, and other small positions along the coast, being under Portuguese control since the 1400s and 1500s. And Spain was interested in the North African land across the Straits of Gibraltar and British-held Gibraltar itself in Morocco. And America had protectorate responsibilities over the tiny country of Liberia, set up as an independent country to receive African Americans freed in order to return them to their African homeland. The decaying Ottoman or Turkish Empire. Then at the same time, there was the matter of the Ottoman or Turkish Empire, a great Islamic domain at the eastern end of the Mediterranean and in southeastern Europe. It had lost considerable energy since its glory days of the 1500s, and like old Christendom, it was falling apart. Thus, various newly emerging national groups, principally the Bulgarians, the Greeks, and the Serbs, once part of the multinational Ottoman Empire, were moving to grab chunks of the Ottoman holdings in southeastern Europe in order to establish their own national independence. The English and the French grabbing the rest from Egypt to Syria. The Berlin Conferences, 1878 and 1884 and 1885. All this activity focused on the dying Ottoman sick man of Europe, plus the opening up of Africa. This threatened to bring the aggressiveness of European imperialism much too close to home for the comfort of the major European players. Something needed to be done to head off this growing danger to the peace of Europe itself. Indeed, since the days of Napoleon I's defeat in 1815, there had been a rather high level of diplomatic cooperation among Europe's imperial contenders, sort of a gentlemanly sharing of the spoils of imperialism. They understood the importance of being somewhat cooperative in their aggressions. They had learned some hard lessons from the Napoleonic Wars and had devised a system called the Concert of Europe to bring their mutual tensions under discussion in order to keep those tensions from pushing them to war, and thus having to call on their people once again to come rescue their thrones from their enemies. And thus it was that they gathered in Berlin in 1878 to come to an agreement as to how they wanted to divide up the dying Ottoman Empire and assign Ottoman land to the various European participants, notably the Greeks, Bulgarians, and Serbs. Everyone was mostly happy with the results, except the Turks, of course, whose nationalist fever began to rise in the face of this assault on their long-standing empire. Then in 1884-85, the Europeans met again in Berlin, this time to get out a map of Africa and assign pieces of the continent to the conference's various European participants. Everyone was a winner, well, except maybe the Africans, who were not consulted on the matter. Winner with the Portuguese confirmed in their old African holdings, the French getting major pieces of West Africa, interspersed here and there by English holdings, the Belgian King Leopold getting the rich centerpiece of Africa, the Congo, as a personal feudal domain, the English getting vast pieces of the rest, from the Cape Province in the south, taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars, north through the central part of Africa, with Leopold's Congo being the exception, all the way up through the Sudan to Egypt, and the Germans getting lands of Central Africa to either side of the Belgian Congo. And the Italians got a section of Somaliland at the vital juncture between the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. Under Bismarck's skillful leadership, this business had all been conducted in a fairly rational fashion. For Bismarck and for Germany, this was all part of the German nation's new birth, but also of its growing sense of importance within the realm of European political affairs. Section 2. American Imperialism. America, meanwhile, had its own imperial agenda, again reflective of the American social priorities of the late 1800s and early 1900s. There were a number of facets to American imperialism, but America's three major agendas abroad were Christianity, American business, and democracy, although America recognized none of these as imperialism. Indeed, Americans generally identified imperialism only in terms of direct governmental control of one people over another, the very thing that America had revolted against when King George tried to pull that on America. Thus it was that at a time when European powers, but also some American politicians, were bragging about the human benefits of their particular brand of imperialism, imperialism in the American lexicon generally had become a very sinister word, something to be resisted at all costs, like Satan himself. The Christian mission impetus. The swing of America from the 1800s into the 1900s was a very heady time. Unprecedented material progress evident everywhere, the likes of which were more than just spectacular, they were totally unprecedented. Thus it was easy for Christian Americans, and many Christian Europeans, to believe strongly that the end times, that is, the second coming and final judgment of the Lord Jesus Christ, was at hand. But was the world ready for such divine judgment? A rush was on, supported by missionary societies of all Christian varieties, to send out workers to reap the harvest of souls in anticipation of the approaching millennium. Especially prominent in this was the student volunteer movement, Protestant, but not belonging to any particular Protestant denomination, which inspired thousands of fired-up students to leave their American college campuses and head out into the world to save souls. Soon supporting them was an equally highly motivated layman's missionary movement made up of Americans at home willing to support financially this massive missionary effort. And thus out Americans went, not only bringing the Christian gospel to Latin American neighbors to the south, but also Africans and Asians to the east and west across the great oceans. With this supreme effort to be a light to the nations, America was finally fulfilling its long-standing covenant with God. The democratic mission. Closely accompanying this sense of Christian mission was the idea or doctrine of democracy for all, related to America's rising belief in democracy as the natural political accompaniment to the Christian life, as indeed it had been since Puritan days. But humanists were quick to declare that the political ideal of democracy did not depend on the gospel as its primary foundation. Indeed, the effort to spread democracy abroad would soon be carried out quite apart from the Christian missionary effort, as humanists were to demonstrate in taking up the cause of building secular democratic societies abroad wherever and by whatever means necessary. The humanist procedure was quite simple. Overthrow the authoritarian rule of the traditionalist ruling classes of the various societies abroad, call representatives of the newly freed people into consultation, develop a new constitution, modeled, of course, largely after the American Constitution, and hold elections to fill the offices of the new democratic government. With this new democracy in place, America could take its leave as mentor and supervisor and head home, leaving the new society to enjoy the bliss of democracy. Again, the American desire to spread democracy abroad would supposedly put Americans in opposition to the imperialist practices of other members of the imperial circle, because the imperialism of the others was so imperialistic, meaning non-democratic. But it never occurred to an aggressive America that its desire to liberate the rest of the world, such as Cuba and the Philippines, liberated from the Spanish Empire in 1898, in order for it to plant their enlightened American constitutional practices in its place, was just as imperialistic as the behavior of the other self-acknowledged imperialists. Footnote. Interestingly, it has still not occurred to Americans, who even today are in the habit of overthrowing foreign governments with the hope of instituting there new governments that mirror the supposed American constitutional or democratic model, which even America has moved away from as it's come increasingly under the enlightened governance of an ever-expanding caretaker bureaucracy and activist judiciary. Vietnam, Iran, Russia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, probably even China, have taught Americans nothing about democracy's dim possibilities in other unreformed cultures, even as bloody and unsuccessful as the effort to institute democracy in these other countries has generally proven to be. In any case, as official government policy, America did not really have much of an overseas agenda during the first half of the 1800s, the nation being so completely absorbed in its aggressive movements at home against the Indian tribes and against Mexico, then being caught up in its own civil war. But it would certainly find itself taking up this broader, more global cause towards the end of that century. The expansion of the Monroe Doctrine. We've already mentioned the policy put in place in the early 1800s known as the Monroe Doctrine, declaring that anywhere in the Americas, Central or South, was off limits to European imperialism. Of course, when the doctrine was announced, America had no way to enforce the doctrine, Europe's armies and navies being much stronger than America's. In fact, America barely had either an army or navy when U.S. President Monroe announced the doctrine bearing his name. But actually the policy worked just as well for the British, who did have the power, which other Europeans well understood, to enforce the doctrine, because Britain wanted to keep the door of America open to British trade and oppose the kind of colonialism practiced by Spain and France. The Spanish and French brand of colonialism allowed trade of their colonies in America with only the mother country in Europe, a practice called mercantilism. Both the British and the Americans therefore opposed the idea of Spain, or any other country, grabbing the former Spanish colonies, new states that had just secured independence from the mother country, the British for economic reasons, and the Americans for political or governmental reasons. Americans did not consider the huge intervention of British business in Latin America as being in violation of the Monroe Doctrine, because they viewed imperialism almost completely in terms of the legal matter of who or what officially governed the country, not who did business with it. British business was just that, business, not government, and good business at that. In fact, Americans saw the opportunity to do the same, involve themselves deeply in the economic affairs of their neighbors to the south, without feeling that they were engaged in imperialism any more than were the British. The opening of Japan. Back in the 1500s, Jesuit missionaries had been so effective in making Japanese converts to Catholic Christianity that the Tokugawa shogun seized control in Japan in 1604 in order to block and reverse this process of westernization. The country had been closed to outsiders ever since. Then in 1852, American naval officer Commodore Perry was instructed to open up Japan to trade and diplomatic relations with the Americans. The following year, Perry's ships blasted their way into Tokyo Harbor, signaling the seriousness of their intent to force negotiations. To the great shock of the Japanese, the emperor agreed, though the shogun did not, to the opening up of the country to Western trade and diplomatic relations, and Western Christian missionary activity. This put the Japanese in a state of major crisis. But the Japanese authorities realized they had no recourse but to accept this intrusion, at least for a while. An eventual effort to expel the barbarians was a dismal failure, and then the mysterious death of the emperor in 1867 brought forward a new young emperor who was determined to begin the transformation of Japan along Western industrial and military lines. The Meiji Restoration had begun. America's indirect involvement in the initial opening of China. The British East India Company had begun the process of opening China to the West, to British trade, and particularly the highly profitable and highly corrupting trade in opium. The company had resorted to this trade in order to recover vast amounts of silver coinage that had made its way to China to buy China's valuable porcelain ware, its silks, its teas, etc., a one-way trade, because the British seemed to have no product, well, except opium, that interested the Chinese in exchange. The Chinese emperor attempted to put a halt to this corrupting trade, and the company fought back, resulting in two opium wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, which worked to the advantage only to the British and to the increasing political humiliation of the Chinese emperor. The Second War resulted even in the forced opening of a large number of Chinese coastal ports to all European and American trade. It also opened all of China to Christian missionary activity, which previously had been limited only to the assigned open ports. Numerous Chinese rose in popular revolt in 1850 against the weakened Manchu or Qing dynasty, commencing the 14-year Taiping Rebellion, actually a civil war, originally between the followers of a quasi-Christian Hong Xiuquan and the failing Manchus. The war bloodied China horribly from end to end. Somewhere between 20 and 30 million Chinese died in the war, mostly due to the famine and the plague that broke out within this greatly weakened society. The Manchus were finally able to regain control of the country in 1864, although rebel armies continued to hold out until the last one was defeated in 1871. A greatly weakened China had no real defenses against the Europeans and Americans who now flocked to China to participate in its trade, its industries, and its religion and education. Little by little, the urban areas of coastal China began to take on Western appearances, to the distress of Chinese traditionalists in the interior of China. Alaska. The Russians had been moving eastward across Asian Siberia from their base in Moscow since the 1500s, and may have reached all the way to Alaska with a small settlement by the mid-1600s. By the 1700s, Russians were fishing the region, trading for the highly sought-after sea otter pelts, placing more settlements on the coastal region. The Spanish also sent explorers to the region in the late 1700s to defend, largely unsuccessfully, their claims to the entire Pacific Northwest of the American continent. Some Russian settlement continued into the 1800s, though slowly, because the region did not seem to be a very profitable enterprise for the Russians. In 1867, shortly after America's Civil War was brought to an end, U.S. Secretary of State Seward negotiated the purchase of Alaska from the Russians for $7.2 million, mostly just for strategic reasons, to block further Russian or British expansion in the Pacific that could affect the American position in its own northwest. But when the Dominion of Canada brought British Columbia into its confederation in 1871, hopes to link Alaska directly with the United States were blocked permanently. Then, in the 1890s, a gold rush brought Americans to Alaska in the thousands, leading to Alaska becoming an official American territory in 1912. Hawaii. Meanwhile, American expansion across the Pacific to the Hawaiian Islands was stirring American political interests and controversy. Protestant missionaries, also some Catholics and Mormons, had come to the islands in large numbers in the early 1800s to bring the islands Western ways as well as the Christian religion, with the cooperation of Kamehameha II, who looked to the missionaries for diplomatic counsel. The opportunities that the climate afforded for the development of the sugar industry became obvious, and soon new generations born of the missionary families, termed the Missionary Party, became very influential in Hawaiian social and political affairs. Workers were brought in from Asia to help work the sugar farms, helping to change drastically the demographic character of the islands. When Kamehameha V died in 1874, the dynasty ended and strife hit the islands when dispute arose over the succession. This brought both American and British troops to the islands to settle things down, and David Kalakaua to the throne. But the new king attempted to rule as an absolute monarch at a time when the sugar economy was undergoing a global recession. His spendthrift ways and his love of global travel had also helped put the Hawaiian economy in trouble. And there were growing demands for him to cut back on his arbitrary powers. His refusal led to a revolt in 1887 in which he was unable to bring under control. At this point, Hawaiian politics moved under the patronage of the Hawaiian League, an elite group of wealthy white American sugar plantation owners and the core of the Missionary Party. They forced on the king a new constitution, which created an assembly, but also a house of nobles, which they controlled, and which now basically dominated Hawaiian politics. When King Kalakaua died in 1891, his sister Liliuokalani took the throne as Queen of Hawaii. She immediately set aside the 1887 Constitution in order to restore full powers to the throne, setting off a revolt in 1893. The Missionary Party requested U.S. Marines to intervene, thus bringing the revolt to an end and the monarchy as well. A Hawaiian Republic was declared, and a provisional government was set up in 1894 with Sanford Dole serving as the Hawaiian president, and the new government sent a request to the U.S. Congress that the islands be annexed to the U.S. as an official U.S. territory. There was much debate in Congress about the legitimacy of such an imperialistic move on the part of the United States, and when a treaty of annexation was sent to the Senate for ratification, it failed to gain the two-thirds vote necessary for approval. Thus, the pro-annexation party in Congress reauthorized the move as simply a resolution, requiring only a majority approval, but in both houses of Congress. Thus, in 1898, Congress approved, barely, and McKinley signed the Treaty of the Annexation of Hawaii, which took place officially in August of 1898, at about the time that a conflict was breaking out with Spain over its actions in Cuba. The Spanish-American War. We've already introduced discussion of this event in terms of Roosevelt's part in it. To elaborate a bit, it's necessary to put the event in terms of the social, cultural, political context of the day. We're, of course, talking about the imperialist fever, which was actually beginning to infect many Americans as much as the Europeans. Since the publication in 1890 of U.S. Admiral Alfred Thayer Mahane's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783, interest in American involvement on the larger world stage was growing quickly. Mahane laid out a very compelling argument, stating how sea power would be the determining factor in the ultimate success of any nation's imperial strategy. Consequently, in the thinking of the growing imperialist party in America, which would include Roosevelt, America needed to get into the act as a victor in the imperialist game, lest it become a victim instead. Meanwhile, just offshore from Florida, the Cubans were fighting for their independence from Spain, and the Spanish were absolutely determined to give up no more Spanish territory in the Americas. The violence between the two groups thus grew ugly. It was also affecting the huge sugar industry, largely under American domination. That is, almost 90% of Cuba's huge sugar exports went to the U.S. A large number of Americans began to call for U.S. intervention in the Spanish-Cuban conflict. President McKinley, however, aware of the complexity of the crisis, instead sought to work with the Spanish government to see how a compromise could settle things down in Cuba. Also, the increasing talk of intervening in the Cuban question was stirring much opposition, coming from the strongly anti-imperialist party, Bryan, being a chief voice for this group. In the midst of this controversy were the Hearst and Pulitzer newspapers, hyping the issue of the Spanish actions in Cuba to increase their New York readership. Consequently, the American warship USS Maine was sent in January of 1898 to Havana to put a chill on the violence. But then when the next month the Maine blew up in Havana harbor, the newspapers went wild with outrage at the Spanish government for having committed this vile act. An official investigation into the tragedy concluded that this was an act of perfidy on the part of the Spanish government. Footnote: the actual evidence itself was very inconclusive and is still under debate even today, although most researchers think that the explosion occurred from within the ship, possibly from a coal fume or methane gas buildup, and not from a Spanish mine outside the boat. With the publication of the findings at the end of March, Americans demanded war with Spain. Less than a month later, both sides had declared war with each other. The war was of very brief duration, but of great consequence. With the capture of Santiago, by way of the Battle of San Juan Hill, and the destruction of both the Spanish fleet and army based there, the Spanish quickly lost their hold over Cuba. But the action also reached all the way across the Pacific to the Spanish Philippine Islands and the Pacific island of Guam. In the Philippines, over 300 years of Spanish rule had been under challenge, much like events in Cuba, since 1896 by a liberal party of Filipinos demanding independence. Thus, the position of Spain in the Philippines was very shaky at the time war between America and Spain was declared. Even before action in Cuba had taken place, Americans made their move on the Spanish Philippines. As the first military action in the war, American Admiral Dewey's fleet moved on the Spanish fleet based in Manila, quickly destroying the Spanish fleet in a single day's action on the first day of May, 1898. Troubles then developed when warships from Britain, France, Germany, and Japan showed up at Manila, expecting to participate in the opening of the Philippines. Most aggressive were the Germans, who sent numerous warships, having previously expected the Americans to be defeated by the Spanish and thus giving Germany the opportunity to take over the islands. But the Americans were quick to gain control over the islands, finally seizing the capital of Manila itself on August the 13th, a day after a peace agreement had already been worked out between Spain and America. Then American cooperation with the Filipino rebels abruptly ceased when American commanders refused to let the rebels enter Manila with the victorious American troops. Resentment flared, beginning a conflict between the Americans and the Filipino rebels, who immediately declared a Philippine Republic. The Americans, however, were unwilling to surrender their role as protectors of the Philippines, and the Philippine-American War broke out, one that would drag on officially until 1903, although guerrilla action continued sporadically in the Philippines provinces for 10 more years after that, and become much more bloody than had been the war with the Spanish during the summer of 1898. The 1902 Philippine Organic Act helped settle things a bit, giving the Filipinos limited self-government in the form of a Philippine Assembly, elected by a select section of Philippine society. Eventually, under the urging by President Wilson, the Filipinos were promised eventual independence with the 1916 Philippine Autonomy Act. The Boxer Rebellion, 1898 to 1901, and its aftermath. Cooperation continued to be the general rule in the continuing opening of China by the European imperialists, joined by America, and now also by Japan, which had developed its own modern army and navy and a modern industrial economy to support its modern military. Towards the end of the 1800s, Chinese resentment flared over the increasing domination of their society by these outsiders, especially from the Japanese, who humiliated the Chinese in the Chinese-Japanese or Sino-Japanese War of 1894-1895, fought largely over the matter of control of Korea. This humiliation led to a demand by both Chinese modernizers for more reform of the country along Western lines, and by traditionalists, members of the Boxer movement, pressing for a return of China to the greatness of its glorious past. The Boxers were the first to act, breaking out in rebellion in 1899 against the Manchu, or Qing dynasty, and against Western foreigners, but especially against fellow Chinese who had taken up Western ways, whom they murdered in vast numbers. Joint action by the English, Germans, French, Americans, and Japanese, among others, finally crushed the rebellion in 1901. This was followed by the execution, by Japanese swords, of thousands of rebels, and the permanent stationing of foreign troops in the Manchu capital at Beijing. It also included the agreement by the Manchu government to send annual indemnity payments to members of the eight-nation coalition in the amount of virtually the entire annual Chinese governmental budget over the next 39 years. But at least China was not divided up like Africa and the Ottoman Empire because of an open-door policy put forward in 1899 by the American Secretary of State, John Hay, a policy importantly supported by the British. This enabled tradesmen to operate anywhere in China rather than just in designated areas. It also served to preserve the unity of China, pleasing somewhat the anti-imperialist party in the U.S. Congress. Nonetheless, the Manchus could not deliver on the agreed indemnity payments, and their government, despite efforts at Western-style reform, finally collapsed, with local warlords now taking over different regions of China. China thus found itself involved in chaotic civil strife. This in turn moved the Chinese modernizers, or nationalists, known as the Kuomintang, in 1911 to depose the last of the Manchu emperors in an effort to establish a Chinese republic. However, a political mishap occurred along the nationalist pathway towards the Republican government when, in the process of trying to bring Chinese warlords under control of the new Republican government, Nationalist Army General Yuan Shikai came close to establishing a personal dictatorship. He died, however, in 1916, ending this problem, but increasing the ability of the warlords to operate even more independently of the Republican government. It would take a massive effort on the part of the Kuomintang and the skillful leadership of Dr. Sun Yat-sen almost 10 more years to bring the warlords under some degree of control by the Republic, although even then, not fully so. Teddy Roosevelt's heavy involvement in foreign affairs, negotiating an end to the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. It was Roosevelt that truly brought America into the game of international diplomacy as a major power broker. In 1905, he hosted in New Hampshire a peace conference to help the Russians and Japanese work out a settlement, ending their war fought along the eastern coast of the Pacific. It cost the Russian army and navy dearly, and the Russian Tsar his standing in the hearts of his own people. The skillful diplomatic negotiator Roosevelt balanced the interests of both sides in such a way that a final settlement would cause Russia the least amount of loss of face, yet give Japan the recognition as a rising power that it so eagerly sought. Roosevelt had no idealistic cause of his or America's own to pursue in this matter, yet the action brought notice to the world that America was actually much more sophisticated politically than they had previously believed, because America was still believed at that time by Europeans to be merely a land of cowboys and Indians. It also brought Roosevelt in 1906 the Nobel Peace Prize for his mediation in ending the Russo-Japanese War, helping to resolve the Moroccan crisis, 1906. Also, Roosevelt was personally present at the Algeciras Conference in southern Spain, which was called, also in 1906, to resolve a growing naval confrontation between Germany on the one hand and Britain and France on the other, over the status of the still somewhat independent Sultanate of Morocco on the North African coast just opposite Spain. Roosevelt threw America's weight to the British and the French side, forcing Germany to back away from a needless confrontation that looked as if it might lead to all-out war if allowed to continue. Footnote. Unfortunately, the settlement only postponed the conflict. It reappeared again in 1911, which again was negotiated to a standoff, and then in 1914, at which point all parties involved lost complete control over events. that marks the startup of World War I. The Panama Canal. America had long looked at the necessity of connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in the narrowing strip of land constituting the southern portion of Central America. The French jumped at the opportunity first, signing an expensive deal with the Colombian government to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama, but had to drop the project because of the way malaria kept striking down their workers. Politicians in Washington, in the meantime, had been looking at the possibility of building a canal across the wider but flatter expanse at Nicaragua. The French anticipated this move by offering to sell their Panama Canal rights cheap and help to move things along politically, that is, Panamanian independence, when the Colombian Senate refused to accept the transfer. Thus, America took up the project in 1904 with the newly independent government of Panama, first solving the malaria problem, that is, with mosquito control and through vaccinations, and then putting their heart and soul into the massive digging involved. For Roosevelt, this became a chief project of his, not being able personally to complete the project during his presidency, which the presidency ended in 1908, but following closely the progress on the project until its completion in 1914. The sending of the U.S. Great White Fleet around the world, 1907 to 1909. Roosevelt, who was entranced with naval power as the underpinning of national greatness, decided in the very last year of his presidency that it was time for America to demonstrate its greatness. Footnote. Not just to the great European powers, but also the Japanese, who, having just humiliated Russia in a significant naval war in East Asia, seemed to pose something of a challenge to America and its position in Asia, achieved through the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt moved by sending 16 battleships of the U.S. Navy around the world. There were many hurdles that had to be crossed to get this operation underway. The lack of coaling stations needed to refuel the ship's engines, the fact that the Panama Canal was not yet completed, and the opposition to the plan by congressmen who thought this all to be a needless government expense. But Roosevelt forged ahead anyway, had the hulls of the ships painted white, thus the nickname for the fleet, and sent them on their way. They would complete the voyage a year later, just as Roosevelt was leaving the White House. It had been indeed an impressive display of American power, and Roosevelt was well satisfied that it had achieved the results he so deeply desired. It certainly marked America as a rising world power.